this has happened to you. Have you ever been in a situation, speaking a language that you may not speak very well, when the conversation gets so interesting, you temporarily forget that you're using another language? If this is happening to you, that's when you're acquiring. When your focus is completely on the message, what the other person is saying, and your anxiety is temporarily gone. I finally learned what they tried to teach us in educational psychology. The amount of drive or anxiety necessary to accomplish a task depends on the task. Sometimes we call facilitative anxiety is okay. Sometimes a little anxiety is okay. Language acquisition, though, is different. For language acquisition to succeed, anxiety has to be directed somewhere else, not at the language. Frank Smith puts it this way: for the child to develop literacy, the child has to assume that she's going to be successful. The way we integrate this into the theory is like this. If the student isn't motivated, if self-esteem is low, if anxiety is high, if the student is on the defensive, if the student thinks the language class is a place where his weaknesses will be revealed, he may understand the input, but it won't penetrate. It won't reach those parts of the brain that do language acquisition. A block keeps it out. Here's how it works. Somewhere in the brain, Chomsky tells us, is a language acquisition device. Our job is to get input into the device. Low motivation, low self-esteem, high anxiety, the block goes up, and the input cannot get in. Explains how it can be that we can have two children in the same class, both getting comprehensible input. One makes progress, the other doesn't. One is open to the input, the other's closed. Let me now try to summarize everything I've said in the last 10, 15 minutes or so, and I'll summarize it in one sentence. We acquire language in one way, and only one way, when we get comprehensible input in a low anxiety environment.
The
next question you should ask is, what about grammar, and what about doing it in class?
Yeah. So the first thing people want to do is to understand the rules of the language, which is grammar, right? So how about grammar?
We have changed cause and effect. The cause is comprehensible input. The result is you acquire grammar. You don't learn it, you acquire grammar. Grammar is very tough to use. People ask me, what about grammar? Do you forbid grammar teaching? No, I don't forbid it, but it's hard to use. If you're speaking another language, think about a language that you're kind of so-so, intermediate. While you're speaking, you want to apply grammar rules. It's very difficult to do. Grammar isn't bad, it's very, very limited. It's limited. If you want to use grammar while you're speaking, number one, you have to know the rule. We don't know all the rules, not even close. The person in the world who knows the most rules is a man named Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky knows more about English than anyone who has ever lived. Oh, absolutely, he knows everything. He's tried to create universal grammars by doing a correct description of English. He knows a lot. You ask him, how many rules of English do you know? Chomsky will say, we've only described small parts, only fragments. The grammar experts who write the books know fewer rules than Chomsky. Best language teachers know fewer rules than the people who write grammar books. The best teachers don't teach every rule that they know. The best students don't understand all the rules that they're taught. So we're talking about a very small part of the grammar of language. So that's number one. You've got to know the rules, and that's impossible. Number two, if you want to use grammar while you're having a conversation, you've got to be thinking about correctness. You've got to be focused on form while you have a conversation. That's very hard to do. People think about grammar while the other person is talking, and they plan the sentence, and you weren't listening, so the sentence doesn't make any sense, okay? So this is very hard to do. You can't think about grammar and communicate at the same time. It's kind of like patting your head and rubbing your tummy at the same time. Number three, you've got to have time. to apply grammar rules. In conversation, there isn't enough time. It goes much too quickly. The three conditions: know the rule, be thinking about rules, and have enough time are never met. They're only met when we take a grammar test. When you take a grammar test, you have studied the rule for the test, you're thinking about correctness, and you have time to do it. And our studies, even when people take grammar tests, they don't do very well. This is very, very hard to do. And you know what? We have been doing this backwards for years, and it has never worked. No human being on this earth has ever mastered a language only through grammar study. It can't be done.
Never.
Never.
There is no exception. There might be some genius who memorized the whole dictionary and the grammar rules.
You know, we have people who've done that, who have basically memorized the dictionary, but you can't learn all the grammar rules because we don't even know them. The grammar book is incomplete. So it simply can't be done. And the people who do it by grammar, they're very famous cases. They study the dictionary, then they go out in the street, they can't understand anything.
교수님과 똑같은 경우에.
Encouraging the child to speak more will not improve their English. We don't acquire from speaking. We acquire from listening and from reading. So that you don't have to worry about forcing your child to speak. It doesn't matter.
얘기인 것 같은데 왜 제가 얘기하면 아무도 안 믿고 클라스 교수님이 말씀을 하시니까 이렇게 쏙쏙 믿음과 신뢰가 가죠? 교수님. 예.
사실은 어쩌면 그러니까 학교에서는 또 이제 학교 시험 위주의 어떤 준비를 해주는 학원에서는 여전히 문법, 단어 공부 이런 거에 아마 많은 시간을 쏟을 겁니다. 근데 사실은 우리 어머니들이 잘 아시는 것처럼 아이들이 뭐 유치원이나 초등학교 다닐 때는 사실은 그것에 그렇게 많은 신경을 쓰진 않거든요. 그래서 우리 아이들도 요즘에는 많이 들으려고 그러고 또 많이 읽으려고 노력을 해요. 그래서 어쩌면 이제 문법을 통해서 영어를 잘해야 되겠다고 생각하는 사람은 이제는 많지 않은 것 같습니다. 그런데 문제는 이 일이 일어나지 않는다는 거야. 그러니까 뭔가 문제가 있는 거죠, 사실은. 그렇죠. 제가 인터넷상에서 온라인상에서 제 닉네임이 슬로우 미러클입니다. 그리고 저와 함께 전국에 한 2,000여 명의 어머니들이 지금 영어 책을 매일 한 권씩 읽고 있어요. 우리가 이제 100권의 책을 읽기로 약속하고 매일 한 권. I love you stinky face였습니다.
I love you stinky face.
여기에 문장 몇 개 안 나옵니다. 근데 이거 정말 좋은 책이에요. 그냥 보세요. 그러면 그림을 보면 그야말로 빠져듭니다. 이 책에 가정법이 나와요. 가정법, 그 어려운 가정법. 알아도 활용이 잘 안 되는. 자, 그런데 이 아이들이 있잖아요. 이 책을 읽다가 그냥 가정법이 뭔지 설명할 필요도 없고 이 아이들은 가정법이 뭔지 알 수도 없어요. 나중에 이제 배우겠죠. 그런데 알아서 가정법이 사용되는 문장들을 이해하고 또 사용도 하게 됩니다.
그렇죠.
어른들이 힘든 이유는 나이 먹어서 힘든 게 아니고 머릿속에 죄송합니다 이런 표현을 써서 너무나도 많은 쓰레기가 들어있어요. 온갖 잡동사니가 너무나도 많이 들어있다 보니까 사실은
IBM이 좀 더 나은 표현 같습니다. 네. 아우 속이 확 시원하네. 네, 쓰레기가 많습니다. 예.
그런 예를 하나 더 들면 우리는 지금 많이 읽어야 된다는 걸 다 알아요. 그래서 무작정 많이 읽으려고 노력을 하거든요. 그래서 어떤 그 선생님이 도장깨기라는 표현을 쓰셨어. 마치 이러한 심정으로 우리는 영어책을 읽습니다. 그래서 500권 읽기, 1000권 읽기.
재미가 없잖아요, 그러면.
그렇죠. 사실은 이 다독이라고 하는 건 절대적으로 필요해요. 왜냐면 많이 읽어야만 영어가 잘 되거든요. 근데 이 다독은 다독하려고 해서 되는 게 아니고 사실은 원인은 딴 데 있습니다. 이런 부분에서도 사실은 커즌 이펙트를 사람들이 바꾸어 생각하는 거죠. 말하기도 마찬가지입니다. 말하기는 말하기 연습, 말하기 학습을 통해서 이루어지는 게 아니고 전혀 엉뚱한 곳에 사실은 이 말하기 능력을 갖출 수 있도록 하는 것들이 있는데 사람들은 이것도 공부해서 사실 얻으려고 하거든요.
클라센 교수님께서 스피킹에 대해서 말씀하신 부분도 한번 보겠습니다. 예.
Encouraging the child to speak more will not improve their English. We don't acquire from speaking. We acquire from listening and from reading. So that you don't have to worry about forcing your child to speak. It doesn't matter.
아주 간단 명료하게 스피킹을 연습해서 말을 할 수 있게 되는 게 아니다라는 겁니다. cause and effect, 그 스피킹은 result라는 거죠. 예, 그 에펙트의 효과 중에 하나인 거죠. 그럼 cause가 뭐냐, 원인이 뭐냐, 인풋이라는 거죠. 그 교수님께서 말씀하신 듣기와 읽기가 되면 말하기도 자연스럽게 된다는 거죠. 근데 우리는 아이에게 인풋이 충분하지 않은데 말하기 연습을 시킵니다. 그걸 패턴 잉글리시라고 하죠. 드릴링을 합니다. 드릴링이 뭐예요? I want to eat hamburger. I want to eat pizza. 목적어 바꿔가면서 그 문장의 패턴을 외우게 하는. 언어라는 게 어떻게 보면 우리 문화의 산물이잖아요. 그럼 모호성이 있는 거를 우리 막 공부하기 시작하는 거예요. 그래서 스피킹도 훈련을 시켜야 된다고 생각을 해서 계속 아웃풋. 그럼 아이가 하고 싶은 얘기를 하게끔 했어야 되는데 우리는 너 무슨 역할놀이 하면서 너가 미스스 베이커 한번 해봐. 그래서 그런 것도 훈련의 하나인 거죠. 그런 부분에 있어서 우리가 영어 교육에 가장 비효율적인 것만 골라서 하고 있었던 거죠. 너무 안타까워요. 우리가 스피커죠.
그냥 많이 듣는 것과 많이 읽는 것밖에 없어요. 가장 자연스러운 순서는 소리를 들어서 언어를 익히는 건데 이것을 누가 공부해서 하는 사람이 아무도 없습니다. 그냥 우리 그 클라신 교수님도 또 많은 또 전문가들 이렇게 말씀하시는데 쉽게 말하면 그 아이가 이해 가능한 소리를 많이 꾸준히 들음으로써 저절로 익히게 되는 거거든요. 두 번째 중요한 거는 이제 리딩으로 사실 이제 입력을 넣어줘야 되는데 문제는 이 리딩이 그냥 내버려두면 재밌게 하기 어렵습니다.
그렇죠.
그래서 두 가지가 필요한.
Talking is not practicing. Talking is not practicing. What does this mean? It means if you want to improve your Spanish, it will not help you to speak Spanish out loud in the car as you drive to work in the morning. It will not help you to go to the bathroom, close the door, and speak Spanish to the mirror. I used to think those things help. Now I think they don't. How do we acquire language? And I'd like to begin this discussion, this presentation, with an outrageous statement. In my opinion, we all acquire language the same way. The reason this is an outrageous thing to say is that these days in education, we're living in an age of individual variation. We're very concerned about how our students are different, not how our students are the same. There is individual variation, and there is quite a bit of it. Nevertheless, there are some things we all do the same. Let me give you some examples. Digestion. We all digest food the same, no significant individual variation. First you put it in your mouth, then you chew it up, then it goes down your throat, then into your stomach. That's how it's done everywhere. That's how it's done in North America, South America, Europe, Asia, Africa. That's how it's done everywhere in the world. We all acquire language the same, and rather than just talk about it, I'd like to show you. I'd like to take just a couple of minutes and give you some sample language lessons. I'll use a language that I'm sure you've heard before and maybe some of you speak. Wir werden jetzt anfangen, Deutsch zu lernen. Und ich möchte im Voraus sagen, dass nach meiner Meinung, what do you think? Good lesson so far? Do you think if I kept talking to you like that, you'd pick up German? Not very likely. How about if I repeated it? Would that help? Probably not. How about if I said it louder? Would that help? Probably not. How about if I said it and you repeated it back? Again, I don't think that would help. How about if I wrote it out for you and you copied it down? The truth is that none of these things help. None of these things mean anything, and I hope you can see that now. And now I'm going to share with you the most important thing I have learned about language. Probably the best kept secret in the profession. We acquire language in one way and only one way, when we understand messages. We call this comprehensible input. We acquire language when we understand what people tell us, not how they say it, but what they say, or when we understand what we read. Comprehensible input, in my opinion, has been the last resort of the language teaching profession. We've tried everything else. We've tried grammar teaching, drills and exercises, computers, etc. But the only thing that seems to count is getting messages you understand, comprehensible input. And this may come as a bit of a surprise to some of you. Certainly came as a surprise to me. Talking is not practicing. Talking is not practicing. What does this mean? It means if you want to improve your Spanish, it will not help you to speak Spanish out loud in the car as you drive to work in the morning. It will not help you to go to the bathroom, close the door, and speak Spanish to the mirror. I used to think those things help. Now I think they don't. On the other hand, if we were a German class and we could hang together for a couple of weeks, say an hour a day of German, and I could keep the input light and lively, you'd start to acquire German. It would come on its own. And eventually, you'd start to talk. Your speaking ability would emerge gradually. Now, we have a lot of evidence that this is true, and the evidence is in the professional literature, in books, in journal papers, etc. I'd like to tell you a story that illustrates the same point. I've used this story for a long time, so those of you who've heard it before, I've been using this for about 15 years, and the reason I've stay with it is that it makes the point very well. My experience took place in 1974 when I was briefly living in exile from California, working at the City University of New York at Queens College as director of English as a second language. And like everyone else in New York, we lived in a big apartment building. And the apartment next door to us was owned by a Japanese company. And every year, there'd be a new family in the apartment. And every year, there were the children who couldn't speak English. And there I was, director of English as a second language. And brag about it to my friends. So I remember going up to the little girl next door. She was 4 years old. Her name was Itomi. And I didn't know about this material on language acquisition then. Nobody did. And I thought then the way you get people to acquire language is you get them to practice talking. So I try to get her to talk. I'd say, Itomi, talk to me. Say good morning. Say hi. No response. Well, clearly I decided I've got to make this more concrete. Itomi, say ball. No response. Well, obviously I've got to break it down into its component parts. Let's work on initial consonants. Say ba. Look at my lips. Again, no response. There's a theory going around then that a lot of people still believe that children don't really want to acquire language. No matter what I said, Itomi wouldn't speak. She didn't say anything the first week. She didn't say anything the second week, the first month, the second month, 5 months until she started to speak. Actually, that's not entirely true. Children during this stage do pick up certain expressions from the other children in the neighborhood. It's not real language. They understand approximately what they mean. It's not real language. They have a rough idea what it means. They use it in roughly appropriate situations. Things like, leave me alone, get out of here. After about 5 months, Itomi started to speak, and several things were interesting about her language. First, it looked a lot like first language acquisition, the same process our children went through. 1 word, 2 words, gradually getting more complicated. Second, it came quickly. By the time Itomi and her family went back to Japan at the end of the year, her English was closing in on the way the other children in the neighborhood were talking. The question is this: what was going on during those 5 months? She was listening. She was picking out comprehensible input. When she started to speak, it was not the beginning of her language acquisition. Let me repeat that. When she started to speak, it was not the beginning of her language acquisition. It was the result of all the comprehensible input she had gotten over those 5 months. Now, a silent period for a child in a situation like this is not pathological. It's normal. It's what you expect. You'd like to have a silent period, wouldn't you? How would it be if you had to study another language, but you went to a class where you didn't have to say anything? Doesn't that sound wonderful? You can talk all you want. You can raise your hand. You can volunteer. But no one's going to call on you. No one's going to put you on the spot. Also, in this perfect class, if the input isn't comprehensible, it's the teacher's fault, not yours. That's how we're doing it now. And the results we're getting aren't a little better than other methods. They're actually much, much better. Before I leave this topic, let me put in a brief commercial message for speaking. I'm not opposed to speaking. I think when students speak, it's fine. But what counts in speaking is not what you say, but what the other person says to you. In other words, when you get involved in conversation, what counts is the input that you can stimulate from other people. So I'm in favor of student speaking, but we have to understand it makes an indirect, a helpful but indirect contribution to language acquisition. Research in language acquisition has concluded that there are several factors that relate to success in language acquisition. One factor is motivation. Students who are more motivated do better in language acquisition. Second, self-esteem. Students with more self-esteem, more self-confidence do better in language acquisition. Third, anxiety. The lower the anxiety, the better the language acquisition. In fact, my hypothesis is for language acquisition to really succeed, anxiety should be 0. This has happened to you. Have you ever been in a situation speaking a language that you may not speak very well, when the conversation gets so interesting, you temporarily forget that you're using another language? If this is happening to you, that's when you're acquiring. When your focus is completely on the message, what the other person is saying, and your anxiety is temporarily gone. I finally learned what they tried to teach us in educational psychology. The amount of drive or anxiety necessary to accomplish a task depends on the task. Sometimes we call facilitative anxiety is okay. Sometimes a little anxiety is okay. Language acquisition, though, is different. For language acquisition to succeed, anxiety has to be directed somewhere else, not at the language. Frank Smith puts it this way: for the child to develop literacy, the child has to assume that she's going to be successful. The way we integrate this into the theory is like this. If the student isn't motivated, if self-esteem is low, if anxiety is high, if the student is on the defensive, if the student thinks the language class is a place where his weaknesses will be revealed, he may understand the input, but it won't penetrate. It won't reach those parts of the brain that do language acquisition. A block keeps it out. Here's how it works. Somewhere in the brain, Chomsky tells us,